Chapter 2 of The Way We Live Now. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 2. The Carbury Family. Something of herself and condition Lady Carbury has told the reader in the letters given in the former chapter, but more must be added. She has declared she had been cruelly slandered, but she has also shown that she was not a woman whose words about herself could be taken with much confidence. If the reader does not understand so much from her letters to the 3 editors, they have been written in vain. She has been made to say that her object in work was to provide for the need of her children, and that with that noble purpose before her she was struggling to make for herself a career in literature. Detestably false as had been her letters to the editors, absolutely and abominably foul as was the entire system by which she was endeavoring to achieve success, far away from honor and honesty as she had been carried by her ready subserviency to the dirty things among which she had lately fallen, nevertheless her statements about herself were substantially true. She had been ill-treated, she had been slandered, she was true to her children, especially devoted to one of them, and was ready to work her nails off if by doing so she could advance their interests. She was the widow of one Sir Patrick Carbury, who many years since had done great things as a soldier in India, and had been thereupon created a baronet. He had married a young wife late in life, and having found out when too late that he had made a mistake, had occasionally spoilt his darling, and occasionally ill-used her. In doing each he had done it abundantly. Among Lady Carbury's faults had never been that of even incipient, not even of sentimental, infidelity to her husband. When as a lovely and penniless girl of 18 she had consented to marry a man of 44 who had the spending of a large income, she had made up her mind to abandon all hope of that sort of love which poets describe and which young people generally desire to experience. Sir Patrick at the time of his marriage was red-faced, stout, bald, very choleric, generous in money, suspicious in temper and intellect. He knew how to govern men. He could read and understand a book. There was nothing mean about him. He had his attractive qualities. He was a man who might be loved, but he was hardly a man for love. The young Lady Carbury had understood her position and had determined to do her duty. She had resolved before she went to the altar that she would never allow herself to flirt, and she had never flirted. For 15 years things had gone tolerably well with her, by which it is intended that the reader should understand that they had so gone that she had been able to tolerate them. They had been home in England for 3 or 4 years, and then Sir Patrick had returned with some new and higher appointment. For 15 years, though he had been passionate, imperious, and often cruel, he had never been jealous. A boy and a girl had been born to them, to whom both father and mother had been over-indulgent. But the mother, according to her lights, had endeavoured to do her duty by them. But from the commencement of her life she had been educated in deceit, and her married life had seemed to make the practice of deceit necessary to her. Her mother had run away from her father, and she had been tossed to and fro between this and that protector, sometimes being in danger of wanting any one to care for her, till she had been made sharp, incredulous, and untrustworthy by the difficulties of her position. But she was clever, and had picked up an education and good manners amidst the difficulties of her childhood, and had been beautiful to look at. To marry and have the command of money, to do her duty correctly, to live in a big house and be respected, had been her ambition, and during the first 15 years of her married life she was successful amidst great difficulties. She would smile within 5 minutes of violent ill-usage. Her husband would even strike her, and the first effort of her mind would be given to conceal the fact from all the world. In latter years he drank too much, and she struggled hard, first to prevent the evil, and then to prevent and to hide the ill effects of the evil. But in doing all this she schemed and lied and lived a life of manoeuvres. Then at last, when she felt that she was no longer quite a young woman, she allowed herself to attempt to form friendships for herself, and among her friends was one of the other sex. If fidelity in a wife be compatible with such friendship, If the married state does not exact from a woman the necessity of debarring herself from all friendly intercourse with any man except her lord, Lady Carbury was not faithless. But Sir Carbury became jealous, spoke words which even she could not endure, did things which drove even her beyond the calculations of her prudence, and she left him. But even this she did in so guarded a way that, as to every step she took, she could prove her innocence. Her life at that period is of little moment to our story, except that it is essential that the reader should know in what she had been slandered. For a month or two all hard words had been said against her by her husband's friends, and even by Sir Patrick himself. But gradually the truth was known, and after a year's separation they came again together, and she remained the mistress of his house till he died. She brought him home to England, but during the short period left to him of life in his old country, he had been a worn-out, dying invalid. But the scandal of her great misfortune had followed her, and some people were never tired of reminding others that in the course of her married life Lady Carbury had run away from her husband, and had been taken back again by the kind-hearted old gentleman. Sir Patrick had left behind him a moderate fortune, though by no means great wealth. To his son, who was now Sir Felix Carbury, he had left £1,000 a year, and to his widow as much, with a provision that after her death the latter sum should be divided between his son and daughter. It therefore came to pass that the young man, who had already entered the army when his father died, and upon whom devolved no necessity of keeping a house, and who in fact not unfrequently lived in his mother's house, had an income equal to that with which his mother and sister were obliged to maintain a roof over their head. Now Lady Carbury, when she was released from her thraldom at the age of 40, had no idea at all of passing her future life amidst the ordinary penances of widowhood. She had hitherto endeavoured to do her duty, knowing that in accepting her position she was bound to take the good and the bad together. She had certainly encountered hitherto much that was bad. To be scolded, watched, beaten, and sworn at by a choleric old man till she was at last driven out of her house by the violence of his ill usage, to be taken back as a favour, with the assurance that her name would for the remainder of her life be unjustly tarnished, to have her flight constantly thrown in her face, and then at last to become for a year or two the nurse of a dying debauchee, was a high price to pay for such good things as she had hitherto enjoyed. Now at length had come to her a period of relaxation, her reward, her freedom, her chance of happiness. She thought much about herself, and resolved on one or two things. The time for love had gone by, and she would have nothing to do with it, nor would she marry again for convenience. But she would have friends, real friends, friends who could help her, and whom possibly she might help. She would, too, make some career for herself, so that life might not be without an interest to her. She would live in London, and would become somebody, at any rate, in some circle. Accident at first, rather than choice, had thrown her among literary people, but that accident had, during the last 2 years, been supported and corroborated by the desire which had fallen upon her of earning money. She had known from the first that economy would be necessary to her, not chiefly, or perhaps not at all, from a feeling that she and her daughter could not live comfortably together on £1,000 a year, but on behalf of her son. She wanted no luxury but a house so placed that people might conceive of her that she lived in a proper part of the town. Of her daughter's prudence she was as well convinced as of her own. She could trust Henrietta in everything, but her son, Sir Felix, was not very trustworthy. And yet Sir Felix was the darling of her heart. At the time of the writing of the 3 letters, at which our story is supposed to begin, she was driven very hard for money. Sir Felix was then 25, had been in a fashionable regiment for 4 years, had already sold out, and, to own the truth at once, had altogether wasted the property which his father had left him. So much the mother knew, and knew, therefore, that with her limited income she must maintain not only herself and daughter, but also the baronet. She did not know, however, the amount of the baronet's obligations, nor indeed did he or any one else. A baronet, holding a commission in the Guards, and known to have had a fortune left him by his father, may go very far in getting into debt, and Sir Felix had made full use of all his privileges. His life had been in every way bad. He had become a burden on his mother so heavy, and on his sister also, that their life had become one of unavoidable embarrassments. But not for a moment had either of them ever quarrelled with him. Henrietta had been taught by the conduct of both father and mother that every vice might be forgiven in a man and in a son, though every virtue was expected from a woman, and especially from a daughter. The lesson had come to her so early in life that she had learned it without the feeling of any grievance. She lamented her brother's evil conduct as it affected him, but she pardoned it altogether as it affected herself. That all her interests in life should be made subservient to him was natural to her, and when she found that her little comforts were discontinued and her moderate expenses curtailed, because he, having eaten up all that was his own, was now eating up also all that was his mother's, she never complained. Henrietta had been taught to think that men in that rank of life in which she had been born always did eat up everything. The mother's feeling was less noble, or perhaps it might better be said more open to censure. The boy, who had been beautiful as a star, had ever been the cynosure of her eyes, the one thing on which her heart had riveted itself. Even during the career of his folly she had hardly ventured to say a word to him with the purport of stopping him on his road to ruin. In everything she had spoilt him as a boy, and in everything she still spoilt him as a man. She was almost proud of his vices, and had taken delight in hearing of doings which, if not vicious of themselves, had been ruinous from their extravagance. She had so indulged him that even in her own presence he was never ashamed of his own selfishness, or apparently conscious of the injustice which he did to others. From all this it had come to pass that dabbling in literature, which had been commenced partly perhaps from a sense of pleasure in the work, partly as a passport into society, had been converted into hard work by which money, if possible, might be earned. So that Lady Carbury, when she wrote to her friends, the editors, of her struggles, was speaking the truth. Tidings had reached her of this and the other man's success, and coming near to her still, of this and that other woman's earnings in literature, and it had seemed to her that within moderate limits she might give a wide field to her hopes. Why should she not add 1,000 a year to her income, so that Felix might again live like a gentleman, and marry that heiress, who, in Lady Carbury's look-out into the future, was destined to make all things straight? Who was so handsome as her son? Who could make himself more agreeable? Who had more of that audacity which is the chief thing necessary to the winning of heiresses? And then he could make his wife Lady Carbury. If only enough money might be earned to tide over the present evil day, all might be well. The one most essential obstacle to the chance of success in all this was probably Lady Carbury's conviction that her end was to be obtained not by producing good books, but by inducing certain people to say that her books were good. She did work hard at what she wrote, hard enough at any rate to cover her pages quickly, and was by nature a clever woman. She could write after a glib, commonplace, sprightly fashion, and had already acquired the knack of spreading all she knew very thin, so that it might cover a vast surface. She had no ambition to write a good book, but was painfully anxious to write a book that the critics should say was good. Had Mr. Brown in his closet told her that her book was absolutely trash, but had undertaken at the same time to have it violently praised in the breakfast table, it may be doubted whether the critic's own opinion would have even wounded her vanity. The woman was false from head to foot, but there was much of good in her, false though she was. Whether Sir Felix, her son, had become what he was solely by bad training, or whether he had been born bad, who shall say? It is hardly possible that he should not have been better had he been taken away as an infant and subjected to moral training by moral teachers. And yet again it is hardly possible that any training or want of training should have produced a heart so utterly incapable of feeling for others as his was. He could not even feel his own misfortunes unless they touched the outward comforts of the moment. It seemed that he lacked sufficient imagination to realize future misery, though the futurity to be considered was divided from the present but by a single month, a single week, but by a single night. He liked to be kindly treated, to be praised and petted, to be well fed and caressed, and they who so treated him were his chosen friends. He had in this the instincts of a horse, not approaching the higher sympathies of a dog, but it cannot be said of him that he had ever loved any one to the extent of denying himself a moment's gratification on that loved one's behalf. His heart was a stone. But he was beautiful to look at, ready-witted and intelligent. He was very dark, with that soft olive complexion which so generally gives to young men an appearance of aristocratic breeding. His hair, which was never allowed to become long, was nearly black, and was soft and silky, without that taint of grease which is so common with silken-headed darlings. His eyes were long, brown in colour, and were made beautiful by the perfect arch of the perfect eyebrow. But perhaps the glory of the face was due more to the finished moulding and fine symmetry of the nose and mouth than to his other features. On his short upper lip he had a moustache as well formed as his eyebrows, but he wore no other beard. The form of his chin, too, was perfect, but it lacked that sweetness and softness of expression indicative of softness of heart, which a dimple conveys. He was about 5 feet 9 in height, and was as excellent in figure as in face. It was admitted by men, and clamorously asserted by women, that no man had ever been more handsome than Felix Carbury, and it was admitted also that he never showed consciousness of his beauty. He had given himself airs on many scores, on the score of his money, poor fool, while it lasted, on the score of his title, on the score of his army standing till he lost it, and especially on the score of superiority in fashionable intellect. But he had been clever enough to dress himself always with simplicity, and to avoid the appearance of thought about his outward man. As yet the little world of his associates had hardly found out how callous were his affections, or rather how devoid he was of affection. His airs and his appearance, joined with some cleverness, had carried him through even the viciousness of his life. In one matter he had marred his name, and by a moment's weakness had injured his character among his friends more than he had done by the folly of 3 years. There had been a quarrel between him and a brother officer, in which he had been the aggressor, and when the moment came in which a man's heart should have produced manly conduct, he had first threatened and had then shown the white feather. That was now a year since, and he had partly outlived the evil, but some men still remembered that Felix Carbury had been cowed and had cowered. It was now his business to marry an heiress. He was well aware that it was so, and was quite prepared to face his destiny. But he lacked something in the art of making love. He was beautiful, had the manners of a gentleman, could talk well, lacked nothing of audacity, and had no feeling of repugnance at declaring a passion which he did not feel. But he knew so little of the passion that he could hardly make even a young girl believe that he felt it. When he talked of love, he not only thought that he was talking nonsense, but showed that he thought so. From this fault he had already failed with one young lady reputed to have £40,000, who had refused him because, as she naively said, she knew he did not really care. "How can I show that I care more than by wishing to make you my wife?" he had asked. "I don't know that you can, but all the same you don't care," she said, and so that young lady escaped the pitfall. Now there was another young lady, to whom the reader shall be introduced in time, whom Sir Felix was instigated to pursue with unremitting diligence. Her wealth was not defined, as had been the £40,000 of her predecessor, but was known to be very much greater than that. It was indeed generally supposed to be fathomless, bottomless, endless. It was said that in regard to money for ordinary expenditure, money for houses, servants, horses, jewels, and the like, one sum was the same as another to the father of this young lady. He had great concerns, concerns so great that the payment of £10,000 or £20,000 upon any trifle was the same thing to him. As to men who are comfortable in their circumstances, it matters little whether they pay 6 pence or 9 pence for their mutton chops. Such a man may be ruined at any time, but there is no doubt that to any one marrying his daughter during the present season of his outrageous prosperity, he could give a very large fortune indeed. Lady Carbury, who had known the rock on which her son had been once wrecked, was very anxious that Sir Felix should at once make a proper use of the intimacy which he had effected in the house of this topping Croesus of the day. And now there must be a few words said about Henrietta Carbury. Of course she was of infinitely less importance than her brother, who was a baronet, the head of that branch of the Carburys, and her mother's darling, and therefore a few words should suffice. She also was very lovely, being like her brother, but somewhat less dark and with features less absolutely regular. But she had in her countenance a full measure of that sweetness of expression which seems to imply that consideration of self is subordinated to consideration for others. This sweetness was altogether lacking to her brother, and her face was a true index of her character. Again, who shall say why the brother and sister had become so opposite to each other? Whether they would have been thus different had both been taken away as infants from their father's and mother's training, or whether the girl's virtues were owing altogether to the lower place which she had held in her parents' heart. She at any rate had not been spoilt by a title, by the command of money, and by the temptations of too early acquaintance with the world. At the present time she was barely 21 years old, and had not seen much of London society. Her mother did not frequent balls, and during the last 2 years there had grown upon them a necessity for economy which was inimical to many gloves and costly dresses. Sir Felix went out, of course, but Hetta Carbury spent most of her time at home with her mother in Welbeck Street. Occasionally the world saw her, and when the world did see her, the world declared that she was a charming girl. The world was so far right. But for Henrietta Carbury the romance of life had already commenced in real earnest. There was another branch of the Carburys, the head branch, which was now represented by one Roger Carbury of Carbury Hall. Roger Carbury was a gentleman of whom much will have to be said, but here at this moment it need only be told that he was passionately in love with his cousin Henrietta. He was, however, nearly 40 years old, and there was one Paul Montague whom Henrietta had seen. End of chapter 2.